Hi everybody, my name is Motsomi Maletjane. I work for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in short the Climate Change Secretariat of the United Nations. I'm going to show you with you some information about climate change adaptation, some key concepts in adaptation so that you may best understand it. But first, before I go into the key concepts, I want to start first by talking about what is adaptation actually? What does it mean? Are there many definitions to adaptation? And what does actually that mean in terms of how we do adaptation? Adaptation is about anticipating and planning for unusual weather and climate events on how they impact human and ecological systems. And usually it's about pursuing several things. We aim at enhancing the adaptive capacity of these systems so that they can withstand the impacts that are brought about these changes in the weather and climate. It is also about building the resilience of these systems. How can the systems bounce back in case there was a weather or climate impact that happened to them? It is also about eventually reducing vulnerability in the long run. We want the systems to be able to be less impacted in case there is a weather or climate impact that occurs. And there can be many ways on how people interpret how they might arrive at these goals. But the IPCC provides one universal definition that helps the global community on how we all collectively address climate change adaptation. Now, getting deeper now into the key concepts in adaptation. And to start with, one of the important ones is to understand the climate risk, because that's the fundamental issue that when we do adaptation, we are trying to alleviate harm from the climate risks that may occur. And the climate risk in itself is made up of three components or three attributes. The first attribute to define the climate risk is the climate hazard. There has to be a climate hazard for us to be able to decide whether there's a risk from climate change or not. And by hazards here, we mean changes in precipitation, for example, both in terms of amount, how much rainfall is there, and in terms of how it is distributed over the year or between months or even by weeks. And then the second component or the second attribute of defining the risk is the exposure. By having the hazard alone is not adequate to determine whether the systems are at risk or not. Think, for example, of having a heavy storm in the middle of the ocean, let's say hypothetically, where there are no land masses or are very far away from transportation routes. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily have any systems that are impacted incidentally by that. So you may not necessarily define risk in that situation. However, if the climate hazards occur in places where we have human and natural assets, for example, our infrastructure, our buildings, human beings present in these places, then we talk about exposure. We can think about vulnerable communities that are living in low-lying coastal communities. If there is a flooding, there is a high risk that they will be flooded and impacted, their infrastructure, their livelihoods, and so on and so forth. You can also think about vulnerable ecosystems, for example, in arid or semi-arid areas. If the rainfall or the precipitation tends to decline, you can already know that the ecosystems are going to be stressed, and eventually they will, for example, either disappear or have to change in the way that they adapt to the climate change. The third attribute on how we define risk, or that constitutes risk, is the vulnerability of the systems. If the changes in the climate, in the weather, would not necessarily impact the system, that is, the system is not vulnerable necessarily, then we may not talk about the risk in that context. But then if the systems are vulnerable, and here we are talking about the things that the systems have, the attributes the systems have in order for them to respond or bounce back. Think, for example, farmers or subsistence farmers who do not have enough resources or enough technologies in order to adapt quickly to droughts or changing seasonal patterns. They may not be able to quickly respond when there is no rainfall, as opposed to farmers that may have sophisticated technology or irrigation systems. So in that case, you may consider subsistence farmers, for example, more likely to be impacted by the weather and climate changes than they could be for other parts of the farmers. This is just one example on how we may look at vulnerability. So in short, To understand how climate change will impact us or the human and ecological systems, it is important to very well understand the risk, which is, as I mentioned, the component of the hazards, the exposure, and the vulnerability. Not all risks are the same in terms of the probability on when they will come and how often they come, but also in terms of the severity they pose. Some climate risks have a high frequency and usually with low losses. And these are, for example, the changes in the seasonal distribution of the rains, slight increases in the temperatures, and so on and so forth. These are some of the risks that it might be possible to put planned adaptation measures or systematic adaptation measures on how to respond to them. I'll provide some examples later on in the talk. The second category of risks you may think of, they are those climate risks that of course may not come quite often, but cause medium to high losses. Here we are talking about, for example, the collapse of rain throughout the whole cropping season. If you think of rains disappearing and the farmers not being able to harvest at all, what will happen? They may not come all the time, but these are the current risks we are facing. And in recent years, we have witnessed these risks. There have been droughts in the Americas, in Africa, and so on and so forth. And then there's also at the extreme end, there are certain risks that are very low frequency or very likely to happen, but with very high losses. You can think of a drought that accumulates over many years and it causes collapse in agricultural produce, collapse in the food systems, even collapse in the income and the livelihoods of the people, and causes eventual and continued decline in economy. So there are these types of risks or the level of severity of the risks that you can think of them. And this also helps us to determine what are the best adaptation measures or approaches that we can apply.